Good afternoon, Frank.
Hello, Brian. How are you?
Okay, I've been watching the economic news, the financial situation here and in England and in Europe and elsewhere, and the English dissatisfaction with the European Union and so on. And it occurs to me that nobody really puts any of this into historical context. And everybody seems to evaluate what's going on financially and economically in terms of debt and in terms of trade and employment figures, as though it's just the current situation. And maybe it can be seen within a context of a decade or so, or maybe you'll remember that people will remember the last economic set of problems, or even go back to the 1929, but it's not put in really in historical perspective. And if you think a minute that the whole economic situation we're in now is so different from anything that we've been in the past, that we have no idea how we're going to satisfy the employment expectations of the majority of soon to be 8 billion people. When the world population reached 1 billion, which, if I remember correctly, was around 1830, the proportion of that 1 billion looking for employment was very small, because the Industrial Revolution had only recently begun, and it had only begun in a few countries. When the world population reached 2 billion, which I think was around 1930, it was a larger percentage, but it still hadn't spread into that many countries. And of course, there were many fewer countries in the world then anyway. Most people were not looking for employment because they were growing food. Now, since 2007, we've crossed the threshold into a phase of world history when over half the world's population lives in cities waiting for people to serve them food, or at least bring them food in supermarkets. And there's fewer and fewer people left in the countryside growing the food and actually in finding their own employment. So the proportion, not only of the numbers of people grown to an enormous extent, but the proportion of those people all over the world now wants employment. At the same time, it's made even more complicated by the fact that everybody now thinks they have a right to stable employment, an income that will allow them to look after their children, educate their children, and so on. But a much larger proportion of the whole economy depends on entrepreneurship. So I finished up today asking the question, of all the people employed today, how many are employed by corporations that existed 100 years ago? How many are employed by corporations that existed 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago? And what's the outlook for the future? Because it looks as though it's bound to be greater economic uncertainty.
I think that's a very interesting point. In fact, if I could interject a little bit, there was a reinsurance conference in London earlier today, and it's always a gloom and doom kind of event, warning about dire prophecies in the future, and unless we change our ways, we're going to be heading off the cliff. And one of the speakers, who actually is the CEO of a rather large syndicate, said, and this caught my eye, he said, unless we change our ways, we're going to be like other companies that have lost their way and not adapted to modern business practices such as BlackBerry and Microsoft. And I was like, what? I mean, I could have understood if he said Union Carbide and U.S. Steel,
Ah.
BlackBerry and Microsoft. And then I thought about it. I said, well, okay, excuse me, I guess they didn't adapt to the latest trend of the month kind of thing and momentarily lost some ground. But your point is well taken. There are very, very few people who are working for companies that are 100 years old, and few people working for 50 and going down that regression there. It's just not there anymore. Another point I'd make is if you looked at the globe as a world state and knocked out the national boundary lines for unemployment, for example, and you considered the following, you considered that, well, all right, the level of industrial production globally is only going to be accretive in the future. I mean, the same amount of steel is going to be built. It's going to be more steel. More people are going to want vehicles. More people are going to be building bridges and homes. Right? The service sector industry, or the virtual industry, is going to grow exponentially. So in theory, it should be that there should be plenty of work for everybody, in theory, collectively, the world as a whole. The concern that we've spoken about several times is perhaps lack of food and ensuring that agriculture continues to subsist and the food is plentiful and can get to the appropriate places. But the difficulty, of course, is that those jobs are not necessarily equally distributed amongst the national units throughout the globe. And there's a constant ebb and flow of this that perhaps you were heading to. One of the things that came out yesterday in China was the Chinese government publicly stating that they are going to close the gap between the wealthy and the not wealthy in China. We've heard this a number of times. But the most telling statistic was that the minimum wage, which is currently $750 a month in China, is going to be increased by 40%. So it's going to go up to $1,100 a month. That's the minimum wage. But yet, even at the $750 rate, which is the minimum wage now, jobs have begun to leave China and gone to places such as Indonesia and Malaysia because the rate is even cheaper. So I think that capital always looks for the lowest means, lowest cost of production. But that comes at a price. I mean, you get development of shoddy goods, then you get public outcry when the conditions of the workers are less than ideal, and in fact, in some cases, outrightly dangerous, and boycotts begin, and those are facilitated by social connectivity. And I'm not sure historically, though, how you would draw a parallel to if any, to what's happened in the past. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, what I'm looking at is the gradual progression of the way things are changing. I mean, one thing that I should say first in relation to in response to what you just said was that The Economist has a recent briefing on offshoring about things moving back to the United States from China, which is part of, I think, of the uncertainty that we're in now. Mm-hmm. But the point that I was making in going through the history before, in a very summary way, very briefly, was that the the proportion of the whole economy that depends upon entrepreneurship has been growing over the last 50 years especially, and presumably will continue to grow.
Oh, more so.
And entrepreneurship is very uncertain. I mean, the number of startups that actually make it is a very low percentage, I believe.
It is.
And then the number that, in fact, stay in business for a long time in the same place, making the same thing with the same staff, is very small. So that means that there's bound to be, in the economic future that we can predict, looking at the current situation and the way we got to where we are now, looks as though it's bound to get more and more uncertain. And that would be okay if people were able to earn enough money in order to save so that they would always have the means to move from one job to another. Mm-hmm. But so we're also told that a very large proportion of people in work today have no savings.
Right. I think you're onto something. I would say that to some extent the number of startups proportionately now compared to say the 1950s. I'd like to see statistically whether or not the percentage proportion is much bigger. I would assume that it is, but I bet it's not that much bigger. I think that it's sort of a hit or miss kind of thing as to whether an economy wants to rely on older 30, 40, 50-year-old established companies that are much larger, or whether they want to rely on thousands of smaller companies that are much smaller, obviously, but provide much more diversity. And I believe the statistics in the United States, at least, are something like 75 or 80% of all employment comes from small businesses. But having said that, you touched on something very interesting. There is no doubt going to be a massive crisis in the United States in the next 15 to 25 years when that baby boomer generation begins to retire and they don't have any money.
Yeah.
They don't have any money. The switch from defined benefit pension plans to defined asset pension plans, the inevitable cutback in Social Security and other social services for Medicare, there is going to be a very big problem. Add to that the mortgage situation, people living in homes that, if not underwater, are barely just close to keeping their nose above water, and they're going to have to continue to make those mortgage payments. The rising cost of health care.
The whole idea that the government should provide health care and education, which began to be taken for granted following the Second World War, first in England and then the rest of Europe, and then to some extent in the United States, is now falling apart everywhere.
Well, they can't afford it.
Exactly the time when it's going to be needed far more.
That's correct.
The way that the future looks to us from where we stand at the moment is that organization of the economy and organization of food distribution is going to depend on individual entrepreneurship and not on large-scale organization. But it's large-scale organization that made it possible for us to get where we are now. And the proportion of things that are organized by governments and large corporations is diminishing all the time.
Well, that's only that would seemingly only be appropriate, given the fact that the proportion of influence of governments on large institutions and large corporations continues to diminish as the rate of globalization increases. I mean, one could argue that a direct corollary of the increased rate of globalization is the fact that there are more and more of these smaller companies that are providing specialized services. Because it's very easy to start a company. And it's very easy to start a virtual company and very easy to begin to do business with people overseas almost instantly.
Yeah, although if, Steve Jobs is on record as having said that it's easier to do it here than in most other countries.
Well, he didn't say that when he wanted to build a plant here. That's when he told President Obama he could.
That's right. He said it was easier to do it in China than here.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The problem I see is in the proportion of everything that's going on that is becoming uncertain. And then politically, we've got two choices. We've got the people left of center and the people right of center. The people right of center want the government to do less, and the people left of center want the government to do more, but they don't have the money to do it with.
Right, right. I only held my head because with some fanfare for the past 3 or 4 days, the Republicans were talking about the House Majority Leader Eric Cantor's speech down in Washington, in which he was going to unveil a new vision for the Republican Party. And I paid attention to the fanfare. I mean, you know, Cantor's an important guy. I get that. He's got a limousine assigned to him and a couple of plainclothes Capitol Hill security guards assigned to him. I understand that. I worked in Washington. I know who he is. But the speech was ridiculous. It was just filled with truisms. There was no specificity whatsoever. And when reporters raised their hands and began to ask them questions, he was quite upset about it. He said, "Well, we'll consider this all in the future." I mean, there are real problems, and that they have to be dealt with, and people just seemingly keep running away from them. And that's at the institutional level. On the local level, people are dealing with those issues. They have to.
Well, I think that the political parties, both here and in England, and I'm not sure about any other country at the moment, are very aware of the problems, but not very constructive in the way they're trying to deal with them. Mm-hmm. Though I think Obama and Cameron mm-hmm. are being very clever, but whether their cleverness will actually pay off or not, because they've got such political problems getting anything organized in order to achieve an objective while they're still in power. But the problem is that everything now really depends on state governments, and state governments seem to be able to do less and less, and that seems to me to be true even for governments like China, let alone mm-hmm. governments in the Western world that mm-hmm. Really have a much more much more popular basis with much less power to actually impose solutions on anything.
We could inadvertently be walking into an embrace of the Tea Party agenda, where at the most local level, the family unit and local unit has to stand up and take responsibility for the way life should be governed at that level. It wouldn't be particularly anti-Jeffersonian, for example, that's for sure.
No, I mean, the interesting thing to watch out for is any degree of organization at a supranational level.
Yes.
And what has been happening is attempts to network at supranational levels. But there's nothing happened yet, so far as I can think at the moment, that shows that that's succeeding in mm-hmm. dealing with any problems. But mm-hmm. but at least it's a step in the right direction.
May I change the topic completely?
Yeah.
I was very happy and relieved to finally see the reports in the past 48 hours from Timbuktu saying that only 5% of those priceless manuscripts had in fact been lost.
I'm glad that figure I haven't seen.
Yeah.
But that means that the Malians have done much better than the Bosnians did in Sarajevo, where
yes.
nearly all the manuscripts were lost in the 1990s.
Yes.
No, I think what's happened in Mali is a very interesting example of the way that the most marginalized parts of the world up until now are becoming equally significant in terms of the way human activity is distributed globally.
Well, that's for sure, and certainly the effects of it are profound. I mean, with the activities of the French and soon the rest of the African countries coming in to supplant them. It's very interesting stuff. And then, of course, what's going on in Syria, we can talk about that the next time. It's quite an interesting array of events that are facing us. And what's going on in Egypt, I mean, it's really something. And in Tunisia, I mean, it doesn't stop. It's amazing. All right, well, thank you, Professor. It was great discussing this with you again, and I'll look forward to next week.
Okay.
Thank you.